Wonderful, wonderful. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are, and welcome to the 6th episode for Securing the Digital Supply Chain. My name is Anirban, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Riskosity. And today with us, we have two very well-known personalities from the Bay Area and very good friends of mine. First on the list is Prasad Ramakrishnan, who is the CIO at Freshworks. Prasad and I have known each other for quite some time. Prasad's background is quite storied, and I'll let him fill you in on that. And the second person is Andrew Daniels. Drew and I also have known each other for many years, and Drew has helped pat my back when my spirits were down and kind of given me great advice. He has been one of the rocks for me in my last 2-3 companies. So without further ado, I will hand over the ball first to Prasad to help our viewers understand his position, where he comes from, his experience, and then after that, straight to Drew. Prasad, sir, would you please give us a quick overview of your background?
You're making me blush, Anirban. Hello, everyone. Prasad Ramakrishnan. I'm, like Anirban said, I'm the CIO of Freshworks. I've been in the industry for more than three decades. So if I start talking about what I started programming in, you would be surprised. There used to be something called as a floppy disk in those days. Anyway, the last 20 plus years, I've been in corporate IT, managing different functions. Most recently, I was the CIO at Viva, and after that, I joined Freshworks as the CIO. So I'm responsible for the entire technology stack here and the technology transformation for the company. And I'm very passionate about the topic for today. So thanks for inviting me, Anirban.
Our pleasure. Wonderful. Thank you, sir. Drew, over to you, sir.
Sure. So, I think Anirban gives me a little too much credit. I basically tell him when I think he's got to be more specific with what he's working on. So I just critique things. I'm like the chef that comes in and just yells and says, "This is not great. Let's do it again." I don't have quite as much experience as Prasad. I've been at this for about 24 years or so. And I primarily have been focused on information security, where I've led security at 5 companies now as the CISO or CSO. But over the last 10 years or so, I've also been involved in IT and technical operations, leading, fairly large cloud deployments as the CIO and kind of cloud operations SRE DevOps leader.
Wonderful. Thank you very much to you both for joining in. Today's topic, as on this particular series, is securing the digital supply chain. One of the things that has come up again and again from people who listen to this show and who are interested in this specific topic, Prasad, I wanted to ask you first, what are some of the important changes in the way software development has been done in the last few years in your time as a security leader? What are some of the tectonic changes in software development that you have seen, which force the supply chain discussion to come to the fore at this point of time?
Great question, Anirban. If you look at the last 3 or 4 decades, right? We had the phase in the 90s and the early 2000s, right? Late 90s, early 2000s, where there was a lot of enterprise grade software.
Yes.
And most of the software, and here I'm talking about the Oracles, the Bans, the SAPs, the PeopleSofts, right? Siebels of the world, where pretty much there was a lot of innovation happening at these product companies, but all of these were software that were installed on your premises, right? Where it sits within your firewall. All of the people accessing it needed to be within the office or come in through a VPN to be able to access the software, right? And it was a very controlled environment. If you look at the list of libraries that came in through Oracle or any of these things, the patching process was a predictable process. They would go out patches every month, every quarter, every 6 months or whatever, and then you apply those patches, right? And then we would continue to keep our software updated.
Right.
Fast forward the clock to the later part of the early 2000s, right? And the age we are in right now, which is pretty much a SaaS only world, right? So this is a world in which there is no notion of a corporate network. There is no notion of an on-premise, right? If you come into my data center, all you will see is a switch and a router that takes you out to the internet, and that's all I have. right? That's my data center, right? So pretty much all of the, we have moved away from the traditional model of pay for the software to pay for the usage, right? We have moved to a usage-based economy, right? Which means now all of these are software that's being developed and hosted on the cloud, right? Either as SaaS applications, or even if it's your own software, you host it on your Amazon or GCP or AWS or on Azure, right? As the case may be, right? So we have moved away from the traditional start off with the C library in a more controlled environment to more SaaS-based applications. In the SaaS-based applications, it is not again that you're going to start writing code from scratch. The emergence of open source libraries, the emergence of pre-built components, which you now have to string together to get your functionality, is the name of the game, right? Where now you have very smart engineers developing and contributing towards the open source. And now it's left to the person who understands what the business problem is and needs to assemble the right components together to solve the business problem, which means now it's more open source than ever before. So dramatic seismic shift compared to what it was 20, 25 years ago.
Correct. Absolutely. That, and thank you for explaining the context, because it also helps us understand that from a business velocity perspective, we want products to be delivered faster so we can capture revenue faster. So you are right about the fact that if I have to be an expert in A and B and C and D, I will be an expert in nothing. So let me be an expert at my thin slice of the business logic and put things together. Thank you for that. That is very helpful. Drew, based on what Prasad said, it is true. What do you see as some of the challenges in tracking down the supply chain artifacts that people are sometimes using?
Oh, I mean, it's numerous, and I couldn't agree more. I mean, when I first started in this space, I was an early employee at NetSuite, and we had data centers, very large footprints. It was a physical rack and stack kind of thing. And probably for the last 10 years or so, we've been really moving towards the cloud. Some are still just doing the digital transformation today, but a lot of them, like companies I've worked for the last 7-8 years have been already on the cloud and moving to the cloud so that we're cloud native. And, what Prasad said around, before, it was a very stringent software library. You were installing binaries that had library dependencies, and they were tested well because you didn't have the plethora of services as you do now. Today, a company, and I know this as an angel investor and strategic advisor myself, companies can overnight develop a solution that may be just fantastic, but they're not necessarily thinking about, as you mentioned, Anirban, they're not really thinking about the overall makeup of the software they're building. You read some of the things that I forwarded you as well, Anirban, recently, and it talks about the average SaaS product today has somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 open source components, and I think that's probably an understatement.
It's the lower end of the bar.
Yeah, I think that's very, very underestimated. And up until recently, when we've seen some of the third-party breaches, and I'm not just talking about SolarWinds. I mean, everybody remembers SolarWinds, but some of these things happened, back 5-6 years ago. Juniper Networks had an issue with their NetScreen firewalls, where they had some open source components that got popped. And, that just raises just so many challenges, because it wasn't the code that Juniper or NetScreen had written. It was code that they had included to, take advantage of something someone else had done. I mean, we all believe that we don't want to reinvent the wheel. If we can modularize our code and we can focus on just the capabilities that we want to deliver and leverage what other people have, graciously provided in the open source community, that's important. Now, I mean, that's your first problem, is how do you manage all of those different components, making sure that, those components are secure, that they're following a mature software lifecycle, that they're actually doing, vulnerability management, both, integrations that you do with commercial solutions, but also the open source. Open source is the wild, wild west. I mean, some projects have good, software cadence where, people are active and patching, and, it's really important to, the infrastructure. And then you have other packages that, may be inactive, or they may have been obsoleted already. And I've seen that in numerous companies where they're including a package. I've actually seen in a couple of cases where companies, included an open source package that had now been deprecated, and they'd made a copy into their own environment and were upkeeping it. But when I say upkeeping it, they were just basically making sure that it wasn't breaking anymore. They were not patching it. They were not fixing it. They were not finding vulnerabilities and resolving them. They didn't have the wherewithal or the resources to do that. And that's just one side of it. I mean, going back to what I said a minute ago, I mean, before you installed things and you had library dependencies and things like that, today, almost everything is browser-based. And again, as we all agree, 200 open source components in your stack is a very low number. But the same can be said about all of the SaaS solutions that we're using. I recently, dug into this space pretty deeply and invested in some of the companies in the space. And what I learned was, and I knew this because, I was a practitioner and I led teams who discovered this, is we thought, being the CIO, we thought we had 200, 250 SaaS solutions out there, because that's the ones that people reached out to IT and says, hey, I need to hook this up to our SAML provider. Or, hey, I need IT to manage these licenses. But once you go out and you discover all the shadow IT that's being used, that number doubles, maybe even triples. Instead of having 200, 250 SaaS products that you think you have, you have 400, 450. And the reason is they're browser based. And they're also, many of these companies do a freemium model. So you don't actually have to enter a credit card. So, somebody goes, hey, I need, this widget that does X, Y, or Z, like a piece of project management software, or, something to hook into my development, chain.
Okay.
And because it doesn't require a credit card, they don't have to necessarily go through the formalized process. And things like security reviews get missed and privacy reviews get missed. And, when these tools start aging out, people don't think about how am I getting my data out and making sure that that data is destroyed. I mean, there's so many problems here that, you could have a team of 10 people spending nothing but, fretting over SaaS solutions and the risks that they could potentially introduce to not only your software stack, but your company and your enterprise as a whole.
That's very, very, very comprehensive answer. Thank you very much for that. And that is very helpful. No, because here's the thing. You talked about a couple of things. One is from a security program perspective, right? It is aspirational at times to be able to say that, yes, we will do code reviews and this and that and all that. How much will you do? And exactly as you said, I have a copy of a particular library that I'm going to keep inside. Well, who's the expert on that? Well, nobody. Well, then guess what's going to happen over there? So you talked about the SDLC process, the security engineering process itself of like who's going to handle this thing, and then the whole wide world of SaaS, because this exactly like shadow IT that we are familiar with that term. There's this entire term of shadow liability that you're essentially absorbing into the organization because you're using all these third-party tools and services. And you're right about the fact that we're not communicating that. Exactly because it's a freemium thing. Let me just try this out and we'll figure it out and all that stuff. But figuring it out never gets figured out. That never happens actually. So,
and I think, see, at the end of the day, Anirban, and I agree with what Drew is saying, right? In many cases, people are doing it because they have the best intentions.
Yes, correct.
But the road to hell was paved with best intentions, right?
And I'm sure this is something Prasad knows as well, being a CIO. The other thing I've noticed when I've led organizations as a CIO is, as I dig into this space quite a bit, I also find cases which are just, I mean, it almost boggles the mind that you run into this, where I find, team A using solution A, team B using solution B, and team C using solution C, and they all do 90%, if not exactly the same thing. And when you ask the teams, why are you using that instead of this? Oh, I didn't know we had that. I didn't know we could get that. I didn't know, that was available. So, having more transparency in, these software services, these software providers, these service providers, is compelling to anyone that's running an organization that has to, manage the risk and the costs of these solutions. As a CIO, that was one of my primary drivers. Security is, of course, I'm trying to figure out business risk, but as CIO, I want to make sure that the business is efficient. So one of the goals I was looking for was I want to know what's out there and why it's being used and why we can't use something else. And I want to make sure that if licenses are allocated, that they're actually used. I won't mention the company, but at Druva, one of the situations I was presented with is IT came to me, one of my leaders in IT came to me and said, we've got SaaS solution A, and right now we have 200 licenses, and we have to do a renewal because it's due up in another month, and we want to add another 100 licenses because there seems to be a steady clip of people wanting to use this. And I looked at it and I said, this was an e-signature tool, and I said, this many people do not need to send out documents to sign. Why do we have so many people with this license? And it's funny, I went to the company and I said, hey, can you tell me who's actually utilizing your software? They're actually doing the things that you need a paid license for. And the company said, oh, we can't do that because it violates privacy. And what they basically did is they latched onto a privacy problem because they wanted to hide the fact that, it's all about the consumption. And when I dug into the product, I spent some time because I'm a technologist too. I finally found, like 6 layers deep, a report that could tell me. And I found that there were like 37 people that actually needed the license. So I went back to IT and says, not only you're not getting your extra 100 seats, I'm reducing you to 75 because, all of these people that I've identified have either never logged in or they've never done the thing that they need to do. And we went back to the users and asked them, why do you have this? Oh, because so-and-so on my team has it. So I figured I needed it.
It's amazing.
I mean, it boggles the mind. I mean, it's crazy.
Yep. This goes back to Prasad, since you have been through companies where pre-IPO, post-IPO, different sorts of companies also, I will pull a thread from what Drew said. From a security program perspective, what are some of the best practices that you would advise companies to follow to make sure that their security programs actually succeed versus just paying lip service to security programs?
My simple response to that, Anirban, is if you think security is an afterthought and a box that you have to check because you're going for an IPO or because you want to go for an ISO certification or a SOC 2 attestation, you've already lost the battle, right? Security needs to be in the heart and soul of what you're doing, whether you are working with one customer with a few employees or whether you have 100 employees and thousands of customers. Your security posture and your focus on security should not matter what your revenues are, how many customers you have and how many employees you have, right? Because I think otherwise what will happen is you start thinking, oh, I'm only 100 employees right now. I only have 500 customers. Let me get to 1,000 customers and then start checking off the boxes from a security. Sometimes it's hard to now imagine and put in place the right security model at that stage, right? If you make it part of your DNA, if you make it part of the way software gets built, the way software gets tested, the way software gets deployed, the way software gets procured.
Yes.
And back to the point which Drew was highlighting, there's a lot of freemium, the way software, even freemium gets evaluated, right? Make that as part of the DNA of your company. Make that as part of the awareness campaign within your company, right? Where anybody and everybody, see, one of the things I always say is the credit card is the bane of IT's existence, right? As long as there are credit cards, there will be shadow IT, there will be new software popping up. But as IT, what we need to do is at least put the guardrails where go back to the reason why is the user going out and swiping the credit card, because they're not getting a service that my team is providing. So go back to the root of the problem, engage with the users frequently so that you stop that behavior where they know that, hey, if I want something, I come to IT, they're going to take care of me, right? So it's where you flip the coin, right? Where they say, hey, I'm going to come to IT, and if they don't solve the problem, then I'll go somewhere, right? Then the oopsie is on you, right? So change the equation. Make it where it make every single employee aware of their responsibility for security. And this doesn't mean that everybody becomes a mini CISO in the company, right? It is just common sense, right? Think about phishing, right? Think about just going and buying software. Think about opening emails, right? Think about sharing sensitive documents. These basic things from a common sense perspective, everybody gets it, right? Because everybody already does that in their home, right?
Correct.
They lock their house before they go to bed. They already have a lock on their phone, right?
Correct.
Of course, the passwords is a different story, right? Right? But everybody does that to safeguard their personal assets. And tell them, guys, use the same common sense thing for the office, right? Would you just go out and buy something because you saw it in the shop when you have something very, very similar already in your house?
Correct.
It's just these basic common sense things. So my answer to your question, Nirban, is it should not be an afterthought. It's got nothing to do with an IPO. It's got nothing to do with your revenue base. It's got nothing to do with your position in the industry. It has to be ground up from day zero.
Yes. Now, I violently agree with this sentiment. Drew, I mean, you've also been an extremely successful company. I will throw the ball to you that in terms of, like, let's say, there's a mindset sometimes for people to say, just focus so much on compliance, whether it's SOC 2, whether it's FedRAMP, whether it's GDPR and all that. How can somebody lift their head and look at the bigger picture when it seems that people are hammering them over the head with like, hey, are you complying with this? Are you complying with this? Are you complying with this or not? Is there a balance that can be reached?
I think there is. But before I jump in there, I wanted to kind of reinforce some of Prasad's points. I mean, something that I tell my teams as a CIO, and as I pointed out, I mean, Prasad CIO, I wear two hats. So I have, actually, I've had people tell me, how do you kind of balance that? And I go, I have arguments with myself all the time.
But, the left brain and the right brain fighting.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, a CIO's job is to, make sure things are available and customers are enabled. But security has to make sure that they're done so safely. And sometimes that can definitely be in conflict. But on the CIO side of things, I mean, as Prasad mentioned, first and foremost, I reinforce in my teams that, those employees are your customers. And one of the things that I deploy, and I don't know if you do this, Prasad, but I do a simple NPS score where, I want, I don't need to have them fill out this long questionnaire or 5 questions. I just want to, every time you interact with IT, on a scale of 1 to 10, how well did IT answer or solve your problem? And then I look at those scores based on each employee, and some stand out as outliers, both good and bad. And I have, coaching sessions with them, and I've had employees who are like, oh, I'm just here to do a job. They'll accept it or they won't. No, that's not how it be. Because if you do that, then people will make end runs around IT just like they would security.
Right.
Because they don't want to be in a friction-led environment. They want to be in a frictionless environment. And it's funny, Prasad, you brought security as an afterthought. I have, as putting now back on my hat, my security hat, I have had, vendors come to me and say, well, we're in AWS, they're secure, right? And I almost want to throw them out of the room right then and there. I'm like, yes, they provide security capabilities, but if you don't configure and turn them on and monitor and manage them, they're worthless.
Yep.
And if
it's like buying a $1,000 lock but not locking the door.
Yeah, exactly.
Or leaving the key in the door all the time. I mean, what's the point of that? I mean, and one of the things that I do, kind of to reinforce again one of Prasad's comments is 2 things that I think are important. First and foremost, part of the process that I follow, and I talked about this in a webinar last week or a talk to ISC Squared, where I do a security review process, and it has, a mixture of questions, but not too many. I mean, I don't want to, bore someone to death answering 300 questions. It's about 75 questions, and I'm asking them kind of the structure of the program, as a service provider, how's their software lifecycle going? Do they have an SBOM? Can they provide me kind of a list of the capabilities of their product so that I can understand how to properly scope the review of that? But also, and I think this is critically important, especially as privacy has become more of an issue, is I make sure that privacy, legal, IT, and finance are all in the loop of the process that we're going to do with the security review. One of the things I showed in that presentation last week is I actually showed kind of part of my workflow that I do, where, you have a tier-based system for vendors, because, you obviously, as a company, don't want to push everybody through the same hole. You're going to have some vendors that have access to, a lot of confidential, proprietary, or sensitive data, like connecting to your CRM or connecting to your ERP. And you're going to have other vendors that maybe they just have a name and an email address of an employee. Don't get me wrong, it's still PII, but comparing that to something that has addresses or social security numbers or patient health information or something like that, I definitely want to treat some things more sensitive and more rigorous than others. To your point, Anirban, and I know this won't be very popular, everybody goes after a SOC 2. And honestly, I have yet to see a SOC 2 that actually excited me. The auditors are easily fooled. Auditors, so the general practice that I've seen out of a number of auditing houses, and don't get me wrong, I've got some auditing friends that will probably find offense to this, and some others that will completely agree with me, is they will hire a principal who has been doing audits for maybe 5 years.
Yes.
But then they will hire a lot of people right out of school, and they'll hand them a checklist and say, you're supposed to go find this thing. And it looks like this, it smells like this, it feels like that. And that's exactly what they look for. It was funny, a few years ago, I reconnected with a developer who I'd worked with at Shutterfly. And he recalled me, but it was for a very strange reason. He says, oh yeah, I remember you. You were our head of security. And what I remember most is you in a room full of auditors screaming at the top of your lungs at them. And it was because they were asking for something to check a box that didn't make sense to our business. And I just was not going to let that go. I was not going to let that bone go. I want these things to matter. I want them to actually improve the security process.
Yes.
So compliance is good, but it is only a part of the solution. I mean, it is good to have a SOC 2 report. It's going to help you, define and support the controls that you should have. But those controls, especially with a SOC 2, yes, they're written towards, the trust services principle and a set of criteria. But at the end of the day, how you scope those controls, what's in scope, what's not in scope, how you word those controls gives you a lot of flexibility to avoid kind of a stringent process in that compliance regime. And ultimately, that can only be one part of the picture.
Right.
And that's why, when I do a security review or have someone on my team do a security review, I have them ask for those compliance things. So we do want to check and make sure that they're actually doing those things and they've spent the money, and that means they care about security. But I also want to see their policies. I want to see, summaries of their vulnerability and pen testing. I want to see an SBOM. I want to see, and the questionnaire we ask, and this is a psychological trap almost, but it's not meant to be a trap. It's just to make sure that, we have people really paying attention to the questionnaire. It has negative questions on it. Because what I found in the past is people will answer the questionnaire and it's like, yes. And by seeing a couple of negative questions in there where the correct answer is no, I can immediately go, this is a salesperson that wasn't, their motivation, and God bless their heart, their motivation was to close the deal, and they want to do so fastly. So they just went in and said, yes, without paying much attention to it. And all it does is it's not somebody where I go, oh, these guys suck and throw them out. It just tells me that we need to focus a little bit more and dig a little deeper, because as Prasad mentioned, you can't dig into everything. And the other thing I wanted to mention, Prasad mentioned as well, kind of small companies, and maybe I'll get to this later. I think there's two main problems with it. Number one is getting it to later, you build up a lot of technical debt. So going back and doing it later means that you've got to, kind of work through the technical debt. And I have yet to see—
Unpack the sins of the past is what we call it.
Right. And I have yet to see a company effectively get through all of its technical debt. There's always technical debt on the books. And I think the second thing that you run into is if you don't start early with the right practices, both from an IT and a security standpoint, you will end up either having bloat or you will end up having waste. And that's not to mean you have to go out and do 100 steps, on day one. It means align your security and your IT practices to your business and what's most important to your business. You know, that streamlining will help you have an effective and an efficient process that is not wasteful.
Absolutely. Prasad, I will pull something from what Drew mentioned in terms of compliance and all these things. And you and I have talked about this a little bit in the past, that from a software supply chain perspective, it's important to understand what is vulnerable if a code library, and going back to those points of that a code library is no longer supported. But what are your thoughts on actually mapping the reason I'm asking this is because there seems to be a chasm in terms of people making products which say, here's the problem, good luck. Well, you're not helping me interpret the problem. You're not helping me connect the dots over here. Why not map them to attack frameworks like Betray and various sort of things? What is your thought process on this?
Yeah, see, at the end of the day, it is about the best analogy I can give is when you go to a doctor and say that you have a symptom, right? They are using data that they find from either your blood test or your taking your blood pressure or taking your ECG or whatever, your MRI.
Yes.
But they are relating it to known data that they have assembled through years of their experience, through years of experience that other physicians and experts have done, right?
Yes, yes.
Now, unless you're able to take any particular situation and relate it back to similar type of attack vectors, similar type of threats, similar type of situations, you really don't have a complete picture. So this is where tying what you have back to the established frameworks, because nobody can capture all the information in the world, right? Now, thanks to the internet, we now have these various ways by which all these things are being consolidated.
Yes.
So whenever you see an attack vector, whenever you see a CVE, bringing it back to the global landscape, right? Because think about it, with the world becoming flat, you're not just dealing with people within your own country's borders. You're now using potentially software which sounds similar, spelled similar, which is how a lot of the supply chain attacks come in, right? But can be coming in from some other country, right? And that's how these people innocently, because we're developers in the hurry to do some stuff, they're going to pull a library which looks very similar to what they think is the right library, and end up using the wrong library, which may not do anything immediately, but it's like the coronavirus. It stays with you for some time and then comes and attacks you, right? So it's about relating it back to known established sources so that you now have a complete picture and then can do a appropriate incident response, right? Because if you don't even know what your problem is, then God bless you, right? And if you don't even know what is ailing you, nobody can treat you, right?
Correct. And that is essentially prayer-based security. That you pray all day and night long, and hopefully nothing will happen. Oh gosh. Let me ask you that from a slightly changing gears, that from a perspective of both you and many other people in your positions are being hammered day and night by vendors like us also, that buy my product, it's the next new vitamin and protein and this and that. What is some recommendation that you could provide vendors that if they want to approach you, this is the right way to do things, not just call me 20 times a day and send me 50 emails and then hound me. What are some best practices that you would suggest to vendors that when they come to you, this is a good way to approach us?
This is a very risky question for me to answer, because if I tell the inside secret, then the vendors will figure out a way to reach me, right? That's a very risky question, right? But see, at the end of the day, right, I go back to what value are you really getting from the software that is being proposed, right? Take the Apple iPhone story, right? Yes. The iPhone did not really solve any existing problem. All Steve Jobs did was people were using mobile phones, people were using a camera, people were using GPS, right? There was the iTunes, this one, right? He brought all of them together into one simple form factor. That's all he did, right? It was an existing problem. He brought things together, right? So when and like you rightly pointed out, I get a million emails. I get a bazillion emails in my inbox. I actually have a rule which filters out many of these things. If a vendor is not able to truly articulate,
yes,
right? So, I classify it as two different types of things. One is I have a problem. I'm looking for a solution. And when I'm doing that, I call vendors and say, guys, come and tell me how you will come and solve my problem. Right?
Yes.
That's one class of software and services that I buy. The second is where I may not have a real problem, but I'm constantly looking for software which may actually come into play for me to deploy when that problem arises. right?
Yes.
So
Yes, yes.
when I'm looking at that, I'm not looking for vendors who come and say they can do anything and everything and become a pie in the sky, right?
Correct.
I want focus,
Correct.
where I want the vendor to now say, you know what, if you look at the overall problem statement, this is the problem statement I'm trying to address, and this is how I'm going about solving it. So
Correct.
tomorrow, when Prasad has that same problem statement, I already know, okay, I did speak to this vendor.
Correct.
He can actually come and solve this problem for me better than other vendors can, because they
Correct.
already know and get what the problem statement truly is. Many people are going with the solution looking for a problem. Instead, start with the problem statement and go with the appropriate solution, so that you're not buying what you need.
Yes. Yes.
Is a philosophy that I use.
It's very useful to hear that, and I will also remember that. So thank you. Drew, since you are also part of the SVCI and you do see a lot of companies from an investment angle, what are some of the best practices that you can offer to potential entrepreneurs who come to you or SVCI as an example? And when you look at them as a company that you might want to invest in as a group or as an individual, what are some of the best practices that they can learn from, that they should do before they approach an investor like you or SVCI?
Well, I have to say your question's a little baited. Prasad's answered the biggest one, which is, and I've told this to several companies that I advise as well. When I look at their sales pitch deck, the things that I tell them is, first and foremost, you're not telling a story. You're telling me a point of view. Narrate it for me.
Right.
Help me understand, how we got here, what the problem is, and then what you're solving for. And I'd like to reinforce what Prasad said. I recently saw a pitch from a company, and of course I can't name them, but they showed a little radar plot, and they said, look, this encompasses this problem. There's 8 points to this particular area of focus, and we help with these 3. And here's why we think we're the best at that. And what that did is that gave some genuine realism to their presentation, because they said, look, we're not the be all end all to this problem. You're going to have to potentially deploy multiple solutions for a more complex problem, but we can help you in these 3 or 4 ways. And I think that's crucial. I think, as an investor, it's a different set of problems I'm looking for. Obviously, as an investor or board member, which I also do, I'm focused on how are you going to increase the sales funnel? How are you going to increase revenue and growth? That's a different problem to solve for. But what I would say to early entrepreneurs is, don't avoid the security problem. Be thinking and mindful of the questions your customers are going to ask. Be aware of some of the challenges out there and develop solutions for them. Never say something like, hey, we're on this cloud provider and they're secure, right? Maybe compliance is the right answer. Maybe it's a security white paper that describes what you do. Maybe it's having your CISO, jump on a call with a prospective customer and say, here's what we do that matters around security. It is all about trust. A customer doesn't know you from Adam. And at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is make sure that, the integrity and security, the trust that you're following, which could be everything from compliance to, process to software bill of materials. These things, belay that, security is important to you. Now, don't get me wrong, and I know some practitioners think like this. Security is not supposed to be, shouldn't be, never should be, a purveyor of no, and inflexible or unwilling to, work with the problem. You've got to be focusing on the business.
Yeah.
You have to tie security to business objectives. Maybe your business objective is growing revenue. Then you need to tie it to how doing some of these things will help you get there. Maybe your objective is to, sell to government clients, and then things like software bill of material and, some of the new challenges around an executive order that was released last year and an ISO standard released last year become paramount. But maybe it's just as simple as, building a trust page and saying, here's, my security posture. Here are some policies, here are some documentation, here's some information about what we value about information security. Because obviously, and this is a challenge that I run into at companies, I can't get on every customer call. I mean, anybody that understands a sales funnel is, you're pulling into the funnel 300-400 prospects to land 30 to 50 customers. So, it doesn't scale to have me jumping on every call. So we need to find a blended approach where we provide some information statically, we provide some information dynamically, and where necessary, where there are more questions, then we jump on calls and we start having conversations that allow us to have a genuine dialogue.
One thing I will add, right? That's very well said, Drew. When vendors come and talk to me, and if they have to go back and come back and respond to security questions that I'm asking, it always is where they're trying to figure out how to answer the question that I'm asking. I like vendors being proactive and say, this is how we are handling, and be open and transparent about this is what I'm not handling and this is what I'm doing about it, right? And this is how I'm going to get better, where it goes back to trust. Because see, at the end of the day, I'm giving my responsibility, my customer data, my employee data, my crown jewels, right? I'm giving it, I'm changing the chain of custody from me to you, which means now the trust is something that comes into play here, right? Because once I've trusted you with my important data, you now have the responsibility to prove that you are going to safeguard it the same way I would have safeguarded it. And here is where you need to be more proactive.
And what Prasad mentioned, that's the thing that we fall down the most at, I think, is handing something off to a SaaS. We're like, oh, I get to wipe my hands of that, problem solved. But all you're doing is transferring all of those challenges that you would have normally had to deal with. And if you're not, paying attention to how those vendors are transferring data, how they're managing the storage of your data, how they're maintaining data life cycles of your data, how they're protecting the data. I mean, I once had a vendor, I had a chief HR officer come at me and said, we want to use this vendor because it's a friend of mine. And I said, cool, I'm all for that. And I talked to him and I said, obviously you want sensitive data about our employees. How are you going to? He goes, oh, well, you'll zip it up and send it to us. And, and I'm like, holy shit, no, that's not going to work. And I went back to the HR
What
office.
could go wrong? What could go wrong?
I went back to the HR office and I said, you realize that they want me to zip this up for them and they're going to hand it on developers' laptops and we have no data control. We don't know where it lives. That's just got breach written all over it. So make sure that you have early on, and it doesn't have to be a formalized process, but a formalized process helps you scale. And it helps you be efficient in your resources, but have a process where early on in the dialogue, you have that conversation. And if you're a company that's offering a product as a service provider or SaaS, I think best of breed in my world is, in that conversation where you're talking about setting up a POC or a demo or something like that, you go, hey, is there some security process that we can do? Let me tell you, this is some of the documentation we can provide you. I don't know about Prasad, but if a vendor comes forward immediately and says, we care about security and we're willing to show it to you when you're ready, that tells me
I trust them more.
Yeah,
I trust them more.
A lot more. Exactly.
Yeah.
No, I think on that note, let us wish that the world for SaaS providers and companies in general is changing actually for the better. That's my experience, that people are getting on the boat in terms of like becoming more secure and understanding what is important. Let's hope no breaches for anyone, at least not as big as Log4j or anything like that this year. Let's keep our fingers crossed and we wish everybody the best. But gentlemen, thank you very much again for joining in on this stream. And it's been a pleasure to have this discussion with you. And thank you once more. And with that, I will say adieu to you both.
Thank you, Anirban. Wonderful talking with you, Drew, as well.
Yeah, excellent. I had a great time. Thank you.
Perfect.